It is just after 1 o'clock in the morning, on the 28th of March, 1942. A lone destroyer noses up the estuary of the River Loire on the occupied coast of France. She flies the swastika. She answers German challenges in German. And for 9 impossible minutes, the most heavily defended port on the Atlantic Wall lets her come. On her deck crouch more than 200 British commandos, pressed flat against the steel, willing the guns to stay silent a little longer. Below their feet, sealed in concrete behind the bow, sit 4.5 tons of high explosive. This ship is not a warship anymore. She is a bomb, and she is aimed at a single target, a dry dock the Germans believe is untouchable. The men know that most of them are not coming home. They came anyway. This is the story of Operation Chariot, remembered by those who studied it as the greatest raid of all.
To understand why a few hundred men would steer a floating bomb into an enemy port, you first have to understand what was waiting in a Norwegian fjord. Her name was Tirpitz. More than 40,000 tons of armor and guns, the largest, most powerful battleship Germany ever built. She rarely fired a shot. She didn't have to. Just by existing, she held the North Atlantic hostage. Britain, in early 1942, was a nation kept alive by ships. Every convoy crossing from America carried the food, the fuel, and the weapons that kept the war going. If Tirpitz ever broke out among those convoys, she could scatter and sink them faster than they could ever be replaced. So the Royal Navy did the only thing it could. It kept its own battleships waiting, tied down, watching the fjord. An entire fleet held in check by a single ship at anchor.
But even a battleship is mortal. She needs fuel, refit, repair. And here lay the hidden weakness the British planners seized upon. If Tirpitz were ever damaged out in the Atlantic, she would need a dry dock, a dock large enough to lift 40,000 tons of warship clear of the water. And on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, there was exactly one. It stood at Saint-Nazaire, on the estuary of the Loire. The Normandy dock, named for the great French ocean liner it had been built to hold, was over 1,000 feet long, a cathedral of concrete and steel. It was the only door on the Atlantic wide enough for Germany's greatest warship, and that gave a handful of officers in London an extraordinary idea.
Take away the dock, and you take away the battleship. If the Normandy dock no longer existed, the German Navy would never dare send Tirpitz into the open Atlantic, because a single torpedo hit could leave her stranded, 1,000 miles from the nearest dock that could save her. In seas the Royal Navy ruled. Destroy one gate of concrete, and you might neutralize the most feared warship afloat without ever closing within range of her guns. It was elegant. Measured against a fleet action, it was almost cheap. It was also, by any sane reading, impossible. Saint-Nazaire lay 6 miles up a shallow, twisting estuary studded with sandbanks. The approaches bristled with more than 60 guns, from light flak to coastal batteries that could tear a destroyer apart. To reach the dock, a raiding force would have to cross open sea, then sail directly into the muzzles of the most heavily defended harbor on the French coast.
The planners looked at the impossibility and went looking for men willing to try it anyway. The plan that emerged was so audacious it sounded less like a military operation than a magic trick. They would take an old, expendable warship, fill her with explosives, and ram her straight into the dock's outer gate, the great caisson that held back the sea. Then they would set a delayed fuse, slip away, and let the ship detonate hours later, tearing the gate apart from the inside. The idea came out of Combined Operations, the headquarters under Lord Louis Mountbatten, charged with carrying the war back to the occupied coast through raids and sheer audacity while Britain rebuilt its strength. Saint-Nazaire was exactly the kind of problem they existed to solve, and exactly the kind no conventional force could touch. The answer they reached, a ship turned into a single enormous bomb, was either madness or genius, and for weeks no one was entirely sure which.
The ship chosen for sacrifice was HMS Campbelltown. She was old, a flush-deck destroyer from the last war, handed to Britain by the United States, one of 50 traded for a string of naval bases. She was slow and worn, but she was the right size, and she was expendable.
That was all the mission required. The Navy went to work disguising her. 2 of her 4 funnels were cut away, and the remaining 2 cut back at an angle, so that in the dark, from a distance, she might be mistaken for a German torpedo boat. Armor plate was bolted along her sides to shield the commandos who would ride her in. And deep in her bow, behind a wall of steel and concrete, the engineers packed her most important cargo, 4.5 tons of high explosive, 24 depth charges, wired to a long delay fuse. The ship herself was now the weapon. Everything else was just delivery.
Around Campbelltown would sail a flotilla of little wooden boats, motor launches built for coastal patrol, not for battle. Many of them carried extra fuel tanks lashed on deck for the long crossing, a detail that would matter horribly before the night was out. They would carry the rest of the raiding force, commandos and demolition teams whose job was to land, fan out across the docks, and destroy everything the explosion would not: the pumping station that drained the dock, the winding gear that moved its gates, the fuel and the machinery that made the whole port work. In all, some 612 men would go: Royal Navy sailors to crew the boats, commandos and demolition specialists drawn from across the force, hand-picked and trained until they could lay their charges in the dark by touch alone. And train they did, for weeks, without ever being told the target. They practiced their demolitions over and over on dockyards back in Britain, learning to wreck pumping machinery and lot gates by feel, blindfolded, against the clock, until the sequence was muscle memory. A full-scale rehearsal against British harbor defenses reportedly went badly. The defenders caught the raiders again and again. To the planners, strangely, that was almost reassuring. If alert, well-worn British troops struggled to stop them in practice, a surprised German garrison in the dark might be slower still. They were led by 3 men whose names would all by the end of that night be linked to the same medal. Commander Robert Ryder, in command of the naval force; Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, leading the commandos; and Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, who would have the job no captain envies, driving Campbelltown at speed into a wall. The men were told the truth. The planners estimated that even if everything went right, many of them would not come back. The little wooden boats had almost no chance against shore guns. The men who got ashore might never reach the sea again. They were offered the chance to step aside. Almost no one did. On the afternoon of the 26th of March, 1942, the force slipped out of Falmouth on the southwest coast of England and turned south into the Atlantic, screened by 2 escorting destroyers, taking a long, looping course far out to sea. To any watcher, they were an anti-submarine sweep, nothing more. The disguise nearly broke at once. On the second day, a German U-boat sighted them. The British destroyers attacked and drove her under, but the fear was instant. Had she radioed a warning? In fact, the submarine reported the British ships heading west, away from France, and the mistake bought the raiders precious cover. Luck, for the moment, held. Through the long hours of the 27th, the men waded in the cramped boats, many of them seasick in the Atlantic swell, going over their tasks in their heads: which charge, which building, which fuse, in what order. Few of them spoke about the odds. There was nothing left to say about them. As darkness fell, the flotilla turned at last toward the coast and began the long run in toward the mouth of the Loire. Far ahead, on schedule, came the sound they had been promised, the drone of British bombers. The RAF was to stage a raid over St. Nazaire, drawing eyes upward, keeping the gunners busy while the ships crept in below. It did not go to plan. Heavy cloud hid the town. The bombers, under strict orders to avoid killing French civilians, circled without dropping, droning back and forth over the port for an hour. To the German commander on the ground, the behavior made no sense. Aircraft overhead that would not attack. He grew suspicious. He ordered his men to stop watching the sky and start watching the water, and he sent his gun crews to their stations. Below, the flotilla came on. Flying a German ensign, Campbelltown led the way up the estuary, gliding over sandbanks a deeper ship could never have crossed. The minutes stretched. Searchlights swept out across the river and found them, pinning the disguised destroyer in hard white light. A German signal station challenged them.
Aboard the lead boat, a signalman who knew the enemy's codes flashed back a captured German reply, claiming to be friendly vessels entering harbor, asking to proceed. The guns hesitated. A second challenge came. Again the bluff. For a few more impossible minutes, the heaviest guns on the coast stayed silent, while the British ships slid closer and closer to the dock. Then a single nervous gunner, somewhere in the dark, opened fire, and the bluff was over. In an instant, the whole estuary erupted. Every gun the Germans had, and they had many, opened up at once on the boats below. The British tore down their German colors, ran up their own battle ensigns, and answered with everything they carried. The water turned to fire. And through all of it, Campbelltown put on speed and drove for the gate. Lieutenant Commander Beatty held his course, straight down the throat of the harbor, the dock dead ahead. Shells punched through the destroyer's thin hull. Men fell on her decks. She kept going. At 34 minutes past 1 in the morning, only a few minutes behind a schedule set weeks earlier in a room in London, HMS Campbelltown struck. She rode up over the torpedo net, slammed into the great caisson of the Normandy dock, and drove herself deep into it, exactly where she was meant to be. Below her shattered bow, 4.5 tons of explosives sat waiting, the fuse already burning. The commandos went over the side and into the fire. Across the docks, small parties of men moved with a purpose drilled into them 1,000 times. While the world exploded around them, the demolition teams found their targets: the pumping station, the vast machinery that emptied the dock, the winding huts that moved its gates, and they did exactly what they had trained to do. Charges laid, fuses lit. One by one, the vital organs of the port were blown apart. Consider the men sent to destroy the pumping station, the great machine buried deep below ground that alone could empty the dock of water. Their officer, Lieutenant Stuart Chant, had already been hit by grenade splinters before he even reached the building, wounded in the arm and the leg. He went in anyway. Down they climbed, several stories into the earth, into the dark and the oil stink at the bottom of the dock's machinery, half carrying their charges. They packed the explosives around the giant pumps by torchlight, set the fuses, and hauled themselves back up the slick stairways, the wounded helped along by the rest, and threw themselves clear. When the charges blew, the pumping machinery, the irreplaceable heart of the dock, was wrecked beyond any hope of repair. That was the whole raid in miniature. A handful of injured men, deep underground, in the middle of an enemy port, calmly finishing the job by the light of their torches. But all of it was done under fire, almost impossible to describe. The German guns, free now of any doubt, raked the docks in the river. And on the water, the worst of it fell on the little wooden boats. They had never been built for this. Many were still loaded with petrol for the long voyage home, and when the shells found them, they did not just sink, they burned. Boat after boat was set alight on the surface of the Loire until the river itself seemed to be on fire. Men who had crossed 400 miles of ocean died within sight of the shore they had come to raid. In the middle of that inferno came individual acts of almost unbearable courage. On one gunboat, an able seaman named William Savage stood at an exposed mount, no armor, no cover, and fired steadily at the enemy positions while the battle blazed around him. He kept firing until he was killed. He would be awarded the Victoria Cross, given, the citation said, not only for himself, but in recognition of many other unnamed men in those boats who showed the same valor and died showing it. On the gate, Campbelltown's work was done. She was fixed in place, her deadly cargo ticking, and nothing the Germans now did could drag her free in time. But the men ashore and afloat still had to escape, and for most of them the way home was already gone, burning on the water behind them. As the first gray light came and the firing slackened, the raiders who could still move began to grasp the truth. The boats meant to carry them away were sunk or in flames. They were stranded, deep inside an enemy port, low on ammunition, surrounded. For them, the raid was not over. It was about to become something even harder. Colonel Newman gathered the men he could find, commandos who had fought their way through the dockyard and now had no way back to the sea. Their orders, in exactly this situation, had been simple and grim. If you cannot leave by boat, do not give up easily. Fight your way out.
Make for open country. Try to reach neutral Spain, hundreds of miles away. So they tried. In small groups, through the streets of an occupied French town now fully awake and crawling with German troops, the commandos broke out, running, fighting house to house, climbing walls, crossing rooftops, with little ammunition and no transport. Some fought until their last rounds were gone, and then fought on with whatever they had left. It was close to hopeless, and most of them knew it. One by one, the groups were cornered and overwhelmed. Out of ammunition and out of options, the survivors were taken prisoner. Newman himself was captured.
Out on the water, one last card had already been played. A small motor torpedo boat, MTB-74, had fired 2 torpedoes fitted with long-delay fuses into the gates of the old entrance to the harbor, where they sank and settled, unseen, and waited. Then she too was caught in the firestorm and lost. Of the little wooden boats that had carried the raiders in, only a handful clawed their way back out to the open sea and the waiting escort destroyers. The rest were gone, burned or sunk in the estuary. And there, the Germans believed, the story had ended. By morning, the firing had stopped. The strange British destroyer sat wedged in the dock gate, shot through, abandoned, apparently harmless. German officers came down to inspect her. Curious soldiers and dock workers climbed aboard the captured wreck, dozens and then more than 100 of them, crowding her decks to see the audacious failure up close.
They did not know what was sleeping in her bow. By then, Campbelltown's captain, Stephen Beatty, was already a prisoner. In an interrogation room not far away, a German officer was lecturing him on the futility of it all. A single worn-out destroyer thrown away against a dock that was barely scratched. What, the officer wanted to know, had the British imagined they would achieve? Around noon on the 28th of March, the answer arrived. The long delay fuse reached its end, and HMS Campbelltown blew up. The explosion was enormous. The whole front of the ship and the great caisson she had been driven into vanished in an instant. The gate was destroyed. The sea roared into the dock the British had crossed an ocean to wreck. And the toll among the Germans crowded aboard and around her was severe. A party of senior officers and sightseers touring the wreck was killed outright. In the interrogation room, the questions stopped. The officers stared at one another. By every account, Beatty kept his face expressionless.
It was not even finished there. 2 days later, the delayed torpedoes that MTB-74 had fired into the old entrance suddenly detonated. In the confusion and dread that followed, a port where things kept exploding without warning, days after the battle had ended, frightened German troops opened fire in the chaos, in places even on each other and on the dock workers. The raid that was meant to last minutes was still doing damage and spreading fear, long after the last commando had been marched away.
For the men who survived, the war was far from over. Most of them spent the next 3 years as prisoners, scattered to camps across Germany. The wounded were treated in German hospitals first, by an enemy that, for all the savagery of the night, seemed to recognize the scale of what these men had attempted. But a handful refused to be taken at all. Cut off from the boats, hidden and guided at terrible risk by French civilians and the escape lines, 5 men made the whole impossible journey, south through occupied France, over the Pyrenees, into neutral Spain, and at last home. Of the entire landing force, they were the only ones to come back to Britain under their own power, and 169 men did not come back at all. Sailors burned on the river, commandos cut down in the streets, gun crews who stayed at their weapons until there was no one left to fire them. Many of them have no grave but the Loire. It would take time for the full story to be assembled, from the few who came home in 1942, from the prisoners freed in 1945, from the French who had watched it all from their windows. And when it finally was, it was almost too much to believe. It read like something invented. Every word of it was real. The Normandy dock was finished, not damaged, finished. It would not work again for the rest of the war. The cost was terrible. Of the 612 men who set out for Saint-Nazaire, only 228 came home. 169 were killed. 215 became prisoners of war. In a single night, a small raiding force had been all but destroyed. And yet, by the one measure that mattered, they had won completely.
The dock the Germans believed untouchable was gone for the rest of the war. Not repaired until 1948, years after the fighting had ended. And the great battleship Tirpitz, the reason for all of it, never once ventured into the Atlantic. She stayed in her northern fjords, watched and hunted, until the British sank her at last in 1944. The men of Saint-Nazaire never fired a shot at her. They didn't have to. They had taken away the one door that could ever have saved her. The courage was recognized as few actions in the war ever were. 5 men received the Victoria Cross for that single night: Ryder, Beatty, Newman, Able Seaman Savage, and Sergeant Thomas Durant, who fought his motor launch's guns against a German destroyer at point-blank range, and was so badly wounded that he died of it.
Durant's medal carries a detail almost without parallel. About a week after the raid, the captain of the very German destroyer that had cut him down, Kapitänleutnant Paul of the Jaguar, sought out the captured British commander in a prisoner-of-war camp, recounted the action, and said the sergeant who had fought him deserved the highest honor his country could give. The recommendation for Durant's Victoria Cross came in effect from the enemy. It remains the only VC ever awarded to a soldier for a naval action.
And those 5 medals were only the peak of it. In all, the raid brought home 89 decorations for gallantry, and its 5 Victoria Crosses are the most ever awarded for a single operation of the Second World War. The survivors carried it with them for the rest of their lives. They called themselves simply the Charioteers, after the operation's name. And for decades afterward, the dwindling few who remained would gather at Falmouth, where they had sailed from, and at Saint-Nazaire itself, to stand together and remember the ones who never came back from the Loire. That is why, long after the war, those who studied it gave Operation Chariot a simpler name: the greatest raid of all. Not because it was the largest, it wasn't, but because a few hundred men crossed an ocean in wooden boats, drove a floating bomb into the heart of an enemy fortress, and changed the war at sea, knowing before they ever cast off that most of them would never come back. They went anyway.